Hi, this is Greg Kaiser. Wanted to welcome you to what's an interesting little addition to my monthly behind the camera feature that I wanted to bring in this month. We're talking about my black and white photography and why I make the choice sometimes to go with black and white versus color. It's not just as simple as I want it to appear timeless or classy or anything like that. There's actually a formula that kind of goes into effect when I decide to make an image black and white. If you'd like to read more about that, I invite you to come by to my blog, to my monthly behind the camera feature. I'll leave a link to that down in the description. But I wanted to start out with just showing some examples of pictures, and what I've got here is a split screen, obviously. The photo on the right is going to be the raw image, unedited. This is straight out of the camera. And then the picture on the right is actually the black and white resulting image. And I wanted to talk about why I chose to go black and white in these specific situations. These are kind of selected to be representative of 90% or better of the decisions that I make, so you have a real good understanding of my logic behind black and white. So for this one right here, it's a hay rake. I photographed it off the Blue Ridge Parkway a couple of years ago. In the raw capture here on the left, you will notice that there's really some nice colors. There's blues and there's greens and just a teeny bit of warmth here in the edges of these tines where the paint has worn off. When I looked at this picture and was deciding how I wanted to process it, my eyes gravitated to the green. That's really all I saw. I saw the hay rake, which is not a bad thing. I've actually got another version of this that I did in color because I wanted that to be the forefront. For this one, the way that things turned out, I saw a relationship between the clouds and the hay rake that was not entirely obvious in the color version. When we look at the black and white version, you can actually start seeing the added contrast that I was able to bring in by darkening the blues in the sky, which made the clouds stand out more, and they actually looked like they're being whipped by this hay rake. So there's now an interaction between the sky and the main subject, which then turns the picture into something completely different than it was in color. I wanted to really amplify that interaction between my two subjects in this picture, and I think it turns into a much more successful image because of the lack of color. As I talked about in the actual blog entry, we are so used to seeing in color, and it defines so much of our visual world that we tend to gravitate towards color first. And that was not what I wanted to do in this picture. By going in, removing the color, it turns into shapes. You can see the individual tines clearer. You can see the circle part of the, I guess, hub of this rake. The extreme contrast in the sky really makes the clouds just pop, and it says so much more than it would have in color. So that was why I made that choice for that particular image. This is another one where it comes into play. If color does not bring much to an image, then there's not a huge reason to keep color in it. In the raw picture here on the left, you can see immediately that the primary shade, color, hue, tone, whatever you want, is going to be white. White snow, white church. We've even got a white, overcast, dreary type sky. We've got white on the pavement from the ice, which, by the way, was kind of slippery. The only color that really comes in is this dead green back here, the warmth of the dormant trees, a little bit of blue here on whatever that object was, and this bush. Those are not important colors to the scene. Oh, I forgot the wreaths on the door here. Again, not really important. The wreaths didn't take up enough of the compositional space to dictate having any real color there to draw the eyes. It just was not the story. What I liked about this was the shape of the church, the way that the roof goes, just the pattern of the windows here, the structure of the tree, and I knew from how I captured it that there was actually detail in the clouds. Of course, in the raw capture, we're not seeing near that contrast in, but you can kind of make out where the clouds are. Those were the more important things to me about this picture. The color, in my opinion, distracted from it because the color was so sporadic and just took up this area here and this area back here, which essentially split your eyes, and you started looking at these inconsequential areas and you missed the church in the middle. And again, I wanted those patterns, those repeating patterns through the church, the triangles, the rectangles, contrasts within the church, the contrast in the pavement. I wanted all those things in the picture, and the only way that I could see to do this was to come over and do a black and white version. Now, obviously, you can tell the tonality has been changed quite a bit. The sky, I was able to bring out a whole lot more detail, which is another benefit of doing black and white photography. I can bring out the subtle details of the clouds without introducing all kinds of weird saturations and colors in the sky, which is a product of increasing contrast. You increase saturations and colors, and the colors are not always accurate. So black and white gives me the opportunity to bring that detail out in the sky. But more importantly, I was able to reduce the exposure a little bit on the church, make it more of a gray tone, and have more differentiation between the snow and the sides of the church. We start to see those shapes. The way that the eyes proceed through an image usually is they go to the brightest areas first. So instead of the sky being just as bright as the roof, just as bright as the wall of the church, the brightest areas are the snow-covered rooftops, which then the secondary becomes the different textures of the church. The third becomes the sky. I've eliminated these darker areas, from being a dominating factor in this, and now the eyes focus on the church. They focus on what I, as the photographer, deemed important about this picture, and hopefully you, as the viewer, now sees what I saw in this scene. Completely different presentation between the two, even though there's not a lot of color over here on the raw one. It's kind of almost a monochrome type picture already. I just went ahead, took it that extra step, and removed the color, focused on the contrasts and the shapes. That was my main reason for this one. This next example here, this was a complex scene. Cars were all jumbled together. I had to shoot a lot of isolations. It was a little repair shop. And if you look here in the raw picture, over here at the top of the chrome, a little bit where this dent is, there was a bright orange Honda Civic parked right there. And my initial thought was the orange would look good with this teal, going with color theory. The red would then pop, and I thought everything was going to be great. But the problem was I couldn't get the orange to cover all of the chrome. So the resulting image had a little touch of orange here, a little touch of orange here, and of course the rust is also an orange tone. But predominantly the orange got lost and became a distraction and became an interesting hue up here. The red stood out more than I needed it to, and red is one of those colors that you have to be very careful with how much of it you put in a scene. We'll get into a little bit more of that here in another example. But my main focus for this composition was the shapes. Again, the repeating patterns, the circles with the tail lights. I mean, the circles within circles within circles. And then we've got all these little veins coming through the trim panel here, another repeating pattern. We've got a beautiful curve here that leads in. And because of the circles up here, we've got reflections that give a wave pattern on the bumper. Those were the interesting parts to me. And because of the color, the red draws all the attention. So you see the taillights and you see those circles, but you miss a lot of the important stuff here in the background that I deemed part of the composition, part of the picture. By removing the color, I lost this orange distraction here. As you see, it's completely non-existent. That orange hue that came up here, completely non-existent, not a problem. We don't have color theory to work with anymore, which was a shame because it was a great color to start with, but because I have removed the color, we now get this contrast coming into play, and we see these repeating patterns so much stronger. The red is lost, but that's okay because we are still able to see the contrast here with these circles, within circles, within circles. So the image works much better and is a stronger composition without the color. With this next one, this is kind of along the same lines as the snow cover. The first picture here, the raw image, you see it's a white car, not clean white, but a white car, and it's got a little bit of rust tone. So really the only color here is going to be the warm tones of the rust and this little sprig of green. Those are not important to me. They don't represent enough of the frame to worry about, and what ends up happening is our eyes are drawn to the rust. Takes away from a lot of what I thought was important with the picture. The angles, keep getting too close to the edge, the angles here are what was important to me. I like these hard edges, hard angles, the shapes, the contrast with the window. I liked all of those things. I liked the shadowing underneath this body line here. So I made the choice, and this was at the scene. I shot it with the intention of doing this black and white because I knew color just did not factor in. It was mostly a monochrome image to begin with. So by removing the color, we start to look at the shapes. We start to look at those hard edges and lines, and even the residue from the sticker here brings in another shape that makes this triangle more interesting. That edge goes with this edge, which goes with this edge. We've got diagonals here. Nothing is horizontal in this frame. Nothing is exactly vertical. It becomes very interesting. Our eyes now see the emblem of Fairlane, which before, if you go over here back to the color image, that emblem is kind of lost. You see this triangle, and you see this, and then you see all the warmth. And a lot of what I was drawn to was being distracted away from by the color. So I was able to remove the color, increase the contrasts, and ended up with a more effective image in black and white. Now, if you'll remember, we talked about the use of red in a picture. Red is one of those colors that signifies danger, hazardous stuff, emergency. It is something that will quicken the pulse rate. This photo was not meant to be an exciting photo. There was too much red in it, and what we ended up having was a red frame around a red taillight, which means that the most visible part of this image for me was just the taillight. We saw this red being encapsulated by all this other red, with this black being the contrast. So with the eyes going to the brightest part of the image first, we start out with the reverse light, we start out with the bumper, and then it goes to the areas of contrast. We're looking at the finish panel here, and then we go to the areas of saturation. We're now looking at the red. None of that is really what I wanted to focus on. What I wanted to focus on was the nameplate, the Union Jack here, and the lines. I liked the lines. I liked how the composition worked. The red and just having the colors pulled away from that. So by taking the color away, now we go to the brightest areas, which are the reverse light. I've toned the bumper down a little bit, but we've got this emblem here, and we've got the Union Jack. We've got this body line here. We've got this bit of body line here, and the framing around here. So we start to see the shapes more than the actual color of the car, more than seeing it as a car. We see it more as abstract shapes. The emblems and this decal give us a hint as to what we're looking for, but I think it becomes a more strong image with the absence of color. This is another example of a really good use of black and white. As I mentioned, when you start dealing with contrasts and changing luminosity values within a scene, you start to get weird colors. When I shot this, it was inside of a barn. It was an overcast day, but the light outside was still very bright compared to how dark it was in the barn, obviously. And I shot this, and I don't remember how many frames, but it's a HDR, high dynamic range image. So I was able to get exposures built from down here in the shadows to all the way over here in the highlights. So I was able to have detail represented in this frame from both edges of the histogram. Of course, this importing does not show that. That had to be processed out. But had I processed it as a color image, you can tell that the majority of the color is wood tone or the dust on this car, and it all really was the same color. By increasing the exposure, I was going to change those colors, probably make them redder. I was going to have to play with saturation, and then when I was all done, my reward would be still an overall brown picture. It would look sepia. I did not want to do that. What I wanted to concentrate on here was the detail inside of the car and the contrasts with the sun coming through these empty boards, so that you know that this barn is, not well insulated. It is open. Light gets in, weather gets in. We've got these boards right here that have fallen in that are nice enough to point to my main subject. But by going to black and white, I can play with the contrasts a whole lot more specifically. I can bring out more detail. I can bring down the highlights a whole lot more without worrying about noise, without worrying about color shifts. And it just becomes more about the detail and the contrasts. You can immediately look and see we're looking at the inside of a car. Does the color of the car matter? No, not at all. Does the color of the barn matter? No, not at all, not in my opinion. Because what I wanted to concentrate on was the way the light was coming into the barn, the way that the car was sitting here, but I didn't want it to be so dark and dreary. Black and white gave me the option to be able to do that much more effectively. And even beyond the door here, you can see just a little bit of the detail. Again, you can't really see it here, but with the HDR blend, I was able to bring out those details. Those greens and yellows would have been very awkward in this picture with all the browns throughout. So by taking the color out, the color would have been a distraction for how much of these same color tones were there. This gives me the option to focus on the contrasts and the difference between light and dark. Here's an example, and it'll take this one a second because I did a lot of work with the sky. If you remember when I talked about church being able to bring a lot more detail into the sky, when I shot this image, obviously it was very overcast, very dull. I knew I was going to shoot this as black and white because I would be able to work with the sky, bring out more detail, more contrast without it going overboard as far as color. Because there is a blue tint in the sky, that blue would go blue, cyan, magenta, purple, and maybe even have some greens in it by the time I did what I needed to do to get the sky to look the way that I wanted it to look. Color was not important here. The only color here with the white barn and the silver and gray farm back here and the very, very light blue sky, only other colors are the green and the dormant grasses here. Not important. In fact, the visual weight of the image changes because all the color is down here. So now my eyes focus down here. Of course, this piece of trash right here that I cloned out didn't help. It drew your eyes there also. But I wanted the attention to be on the mood. I wanted it to be a very calm, serene look, and part of that was going to be losing the color, bringing the sky in, and making the focal point the barn, which I was able to do. I was able to brighten the barn with black and white. I was able to give more contrast to it, a little bit more pop. I brought the sky in, heavy vignette along the top here. You can get away with that in black and white much better than you can in color. When you start deepening the tones here on a colorful sky, the colors go all kinds of wonky and it just does not work. But if you'll notice, the balance has been able to be shifted. We still have a lot of our dark tones down here, but I'm now able to balance those dark tones with the dark tones up here at the top that I could not do with color. Comparing the two, We still have darker tones down here, but it's all very bright up here, so the eyes, once they get done down here, just escape out of the scene. So to make this composition work and to close it all in, make the barn the focal point, black and white was the option. I was able to brighten the sky a little bit here along the plane where the barn is, so it keeps the eyes here in the center of the frame. And we see the great contrast back here, so the eyes are going to focus on the background also. So these three areas become what I want you to see. The grass is just an inconsequential foreground. It gives texture, gives location, but it's not important. So black and white helped that composition significantly. And I talk a lot in the blog about distractions, and I've talked a lot about that over the years just in my different treks that I've talked about. So with this one, obviously looking at the left image, this was a very complex scene. I wanted to make the car the primary focus, but we have the building right here that comes into the car. We've got some equipment over here, which is yellow. We've got wooden sawhorses. There's a lot of things going on, and while I love the colors of the rust, especially with the blues in the sky and the cooler tones on the side of the building, what I did not like was this yellow, which drew my attention to the background and away from the car. So I had this distraction I had to deal with. And when I came right down to it, what I liked about this car was the way that it was patinaed. You can see where the trim used to be. You can see the different shapes. You can see the age and the wear. Those are the things that were important to me. The color of the grass is not important. The sky, I like the contrast potential, but again, I can bring out more contrast in black and white, which is what I did. Now, with this black and white conversion, we no longer see the yellow over here. This just kind of blends into the building and becomes background. It's no big deal. We have more contrast in the sky. We've got a little bit of brightening right here just to help frame the car. But look at the texture on the side of this car with the patina. All of this shows up so much better now that we've moved to black and white. The interest of this picture is now the car. The building, this stuff is all more or less inconsequential. It's there, we realize it's there, but our eyes stay focused on the car. By removing color, I have directed where the eyes go, and that's what made this so effective as a composition. Same thing with this one. When I framed this up, and this was very difficult, it was sitting on top of a Lincoln Town car, there were power lines behind. Every bad thing I could think of came into play with this one. I used limited depth of field to get rid of the power lines in the back, and it also helped bring more of attention on the car. But looking at it as a color image, there was not a lot of vibrant colors here, but there was warm tones with the rust all along here, which would bring the eyes to this area because we have areas of high contrast, we have a bright area, we have the warm tones. So all of my focus was right here in the color picture. The rest of this became inconsequential. Obviously that's not ideal. That brings our eyes out of the frame, and then we don't look at the picture. I wanted the attention to be all along here. I loved this part of the trim on the door, the shape of the car, the headlight, the bumpers, the wheel, this little bit of tree coming off to the side. All those things were important. So by removing the color, I still have the bright and I still have the contrast, but I have similar bright tones here. I have similar contrasts here. I don't have that added warmth pulling my eyes out of the frame. My eyes actually track through the whole car now. I see this tree. I see the trees in the background. The gray sky, not a distraction. We were able to tone that down, and it doesn't pull your eyes out. So I was able to keep everything very much focused right here on this car, which was my intention. Done a lot of decay type subjects. Let's talk about some landscapes. This was one I shot at sunset at Price Lake a couple months ago. It was the beginning of spring. Obviously the trees had not caught up and they're still wearing their winter dormancy, I guess. But the sun was highlighting this with nice warm light. I liked that. That made a color image. But with this one after sunset, The whole image was very cool. There was not a whole lot of excitement. I had a really nice framing element here in the clouds that I liked for this tree. The reflection did the same thing. These rocks pointed to it. I liked the composition, but the color let it down. The color made it boring. The color made it less than what I wanted. So by going to black and white, I could play with the contrasts. I don't have to worry about the color. I can bring your eyes here to this foreground by brightening these areas, giving more texture. I can brighten this part in relation to the darker clouds around here. All of this works to point our eyes to this area where the tree is reflected. We just have great textures here, but we don't have to worry about sunlight. It doesn't matter if it is middle of the day, sunrise, sunset, it does not matter. What matters is the elements that I liked about this scene, and I was able to bring those out in black and white without the distraction of the color, because with all this overly blue cool tone, it was just too calm an image. It was a boring image. Black and white added the drama that the color took away. So I was able to get a much more meaningful photo with this. Now there are times in landscape when green is the dominant color because, well, green is everywhere. Grass, leaves, foliage, vegetation. Green is dominant in the landscape. And this is one of my favorite trees. It's along the Blue Ridge Parkway. And I've photographed it many a time and just really like how it just stands out. And I liked it here. And the one thing that concerned me when I shot it was the amount of green. All of these trees were backlit. It was a foggy day, so we've got some blown out areas here. They're not totally blown out, they're just slightly specular. But I put them right at the edge of the exposure so I could recover as needed. Remember, this is just a raw image. But all of these similar green tones took up, what, 80% of the picture. Green is a very neutral color for me. It's not a color that I want to make a photograph based on, usually. I'm sure there's exceptions. But the color overran this photo. So I lost the structure of this tree. I lost the importance of the texture of the trees in the background, and it just became, oh wow, this is a very green picture. It feels like a summer day, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted the attention on the contrasts of the scene and on the lines and repeating patterns. So by removing the color, we're able to really draw the attention into the structure of the tree with all these supporting elements here in the background. Again, the slightly overexposed areas are no longer an issue in black and white. A white sky in black and white is more forgivable than a white sky in a color photograph, in my opinion. There's other photographers that disagree. We'll leave that up to them. This is how I would like to present my work. And as you see, the white sky is not offensive in this. It just helps bring contrast to the actual tree. Another situation where this picture actually works as color in black and white. So why did I pick one over the other? Looking at the color image, the dominant color are the warm tones of the rocks. The contrast comes from the water, and we'll save the texture argument for another discussion as to whether or not you like this shutter speed or not. That's not the point of this. But shutter speed that I used gave me lots of texture, which I wanted in this, to show the rushing water, to give something tactile, to give something that you can feel. For me, the main part of this picture was the water and how it's flowing over the rocks, and contrasting that with the more clear rocks that don't have any water going over them. It had nothing to do with the color. I just really wanted to keep the rocks in here to frame the image all the way around and to showcase the textures. Again, black and white allows more to do with contrast than I can do effectively with color. So if I want to really amplify contrast, what I will do is I will take the color out and I will go to my heart's content and happy like I did here. We've brought out more detail in the water. We've brought out a little bit of highlight in the rocks, and that just gives a little bit more texture. We still have the framing here, but because the warmth is gone out of the picture, we don't have to worry about the eyes focusing on the warm parts, because human eyes, for whatever reason, are drawn to warmer tones more than they are cooler. So by eliminating color, I have evened the playing field to where now the eyes go to what is brighter, and they stay there. So they stay where the water is. They stay where the textures are on the rocks. We don't worry about the dark stuff here in the background. We just worry about where that contrast is. And it becomes a much more engaging photo, at least in my opinion, which is why I chose black and white for this one. One last image, and then we'll get back to the blog. But this is one I shot maybe a couple of weeks ago, well, 3 weeks or so now that you're reading the blog. What I loved about this was the setting. Having this 57 Chevy, even though it was 4 doors, has too many doors for my tastes, but I liked the setting. I liked how this car was sitting in a yard that was not mowed right around the car. There was the old, it looks like a barn, it's actually the backside of a house. I liked all those things, but there was a lot of distractions in my opinion. Number one, I could not get an angle without having the sky included. That white sky back here in the background, like I said, white does not look good to me in color for a sky. Secondly, we've got this red and this warm tone here, along with contrasting blue, whatever that is, here in this opening, which is a distraction from the car. The car does not have a whole lot of texture. It does not have the rust that I'm accustomed to. I liked the blue, but the blue was just kind of there. What I liked about this car was the iconic shape of the grille, the headlights, the trim here, the bullets on the hood. I liked the trim on the side, the fact that it's still got its rear skirts, which is a rarity. These are things that I liked, and I wanted to draw the attention there and to the car and to the texture of the wood. In the color image, what I'm seeing is, oh look, it's a blue car. And then for whatever reason, my eyes are drawn to this power pole. I hate power poles, but in color, it really stands out to me. I do not really understand why, but that's how I see it. And I wanted that power pole to blend in with the trees a little bit better and to look more like a tree. So with the blue overpowering the main scene and then having the distracted colors here, I needed to figure out a way to get the attention on the car. And the way to do that was through contrast and focusing on the difference between light areas, dark areas, the shadowing, which modeling is what it's called, on something where you get those little ridges of highlights. Those were the parts I wanted to concentrate on. And of course, I could bring more contrast into the wood in black and white. So I switched it over to black and white, worked with the color channels a little bit, and was able to focus the attention on the grille, the headlights, the trim, the bullets, the windshield here, the trim along the side. If you're paying attention, you see that skirt is still there. You see the original hubcaps, at least I think they're original. The power pole is still there, it's still bright, but now it becomes a framing element that goes along with this tree and this power pole here, which also looks like another tree. So it just becomes more of a natural look. We get more texture into the wood here, and we get this wonderful little mottled texture here with the different weeds growing up, and it's just another texture leading into the picture. So for me, losing the blue of the car and a little bit of distracting colors back here focuses the attention more on the elements of the car that I wanted to draw the attention to, rather than just the color and the fact that it actually looks to be in decent condition for a home paint job. So that pretty much wraps up the examples, but I just wanted to show some reasoning behind why I will look for black and white over color. And again, I invite you to click the link down in the description, read the rest of the blog. If you haven't already started there, this of course is going to be embedded within the blog entry. So with that being said, thank you for joining me for this month's Behind the Camera, and this has been Greg Kaiser. Thank you. Bye.